Welcome to Reformed Thinking.
Glad to be here.
So, you know how it is when you get a medical diagnosis? There's this built-in expectation of precision, right?
Oh, for sure. It feels very scientific.
Yeah, it feels like engineering or something. If you break your arm, you go to the hospital, they take an x-ray, and you see that jagged white line on the film.
Right. It's right there in front of you.
And the doctor just points to the screen and says, look, there is the problem.
It's very binary.
Yeah.
You see the fracture, you put a cast on it,
Yeah.
and, well, you just wait for it to heal.
It's clean. And honestly, I think it brings a certain kind of comfort to us. We're wired to, prefer things that are visible.
Yeah, things we can categorize and put in a neat little box.
Right. We want a clear enemy. We want a clear problem we can tackle.
Which is, that's why the topic we're examining today makes people so uncomfortable.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when you step into the realm of spiritual warfare, and especially church discipline, that pristine x-ray machine just shatters.
It really does.
You find yourself navigating this diagnostic landscape that is, frankly, incredibly murky. It's subjective, it's messy, and the lines are just rarely drawn in bright, high-contrast colors.
I'm so glad you're joining us for this conversation today because we are wading right into those muddy waters.
Yes, we are.
Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack two incredibly thorough texts, and they are both centered around a single brief verse in the New Testament.
2 Corinthians 2.11.
That's the one. We are going to look at how ordinary congregational life, and specifically how a community handles the really messy business of forgiveness, is actually the absolute front line of cosmic spiritual warfare.
And, that framing is pretty jarring for a lot of modern believers.
For sure.
The sources we're analyzing make a very specific, sustained argument here. As Christians, we tend to scan the horizon for spiritual danger in, the spectacular things.
Right, we look for the obvious stuff.
Yeah, the massive scandals or the extreme manifestations. But the actual danger threatening a local church is remarkably quiet.
That is the premise that just stopped me in my tracks as I was reading through this material.
It's sobering.
Satan's most successful tactic in destroying a local church is not overt government-sponsored persecution.
No, it's not.
It's not spectacular demonic events or horror movie phenomena that make the evening news.
Right.
His most successful tactic is something entirely quiet and terrifyingly socially acceptable. It's a bitter, unforgiving heart masquerading as righteous severity.
It really forces you to completely reevaluate how you view your interactions with, the people sitting right next to you in the pews on a Sunday morning.
Yeah, you have to look at it totally differently.
Because to truly grasp the mission of our discussion today, we have to look closely at the hidden nature of this conflict.
Why do we consistently miss the spiritual danger of interpersonal conflict, right?
Exactly. Spot on. Why do we treat resentment like a minor personality flaw instead of a catastrophic security breach?
Well, part of the answer, according to the texts anyway, is that the modern church often ignores the doctrine of spiritual warfare entirely.
Oh, completely. It gets brushed aside as fanatical.
Right. People hear the phrase spiritual warfare and they immediately picture someone, shouting at the shadows.
Performing elaborate rituals or something.
Yeah, or looking for a demon behind every single bush.
And because we want to avoid that kind of fanaticism, we swing the pendulum all the way over to functional naturalism.
We act as if the physical world is all there is.
We adopt a secular mindset while literally holding a Bible.
Yeah.
And simultaneously, the surrounding culture preaches a very distinct message about forgiveness to you.
Which is basically that forgiveness should only happen when it costs you absolutely nothing.
Right, or when the offending party has sufficiently groveled and, proven their worth.
Or, and we see this a lot now, the world argues that harboring a grievance is a fundamental human right.
Like a form of self-care or protection.
Yeah, but the text we are analyzing insists on the absolute opposite. It argues that a bitter, unforgiving heart acts as a literal landing pad for the demonic in a local congregation.
It's an invitation.
Let me throw out an analogy to make this a bit more concrete for you.
Go for it.
Imagine installing a multi-million-dollar high-tech security system on every single window of your house.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
You have laser grids, motion sensors, reinforced glass, everything you can possibly think of to keep intruders out.
Top of the line.
Right. But then you deliberately leave the front door wide open day and night just because you like the breeze.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
In the church, we do this all the time. We watch out for massive moral failures.
We set up accountability software on our phones.
We have strict financial audits to prevent embezzlement. We establish safeguards against huge scandals.
Those are the windows.
Those are the windows. But then we leave the front door wide open through everyday, tolerated resentment between church members.
That analogy captures the vulnerability perfectly.
Thanks.
If we synthesize these texts to explain the why behind this vulnerability, we start to see a really fascinating pattern in how the adversary operates.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, Satan is completely satisfied with two extreme positions in a local church. He does not care which one you choose, as long as you choose one of them.
Right.
On one hand, he loves it when a church is careless about holiness.
That is the classic progressive slide, right? Tolerating open sin, softening the edges of biblical commands.
Yeah, essentially acting as if God just does not care about purity or justice.
Antinomianism.
Yes, antinomianism, living as if there is no moral law whatsoever. Satan is totally thrilled with that.
But the texts argue he is equally thrilled when a church becomes cruel under the guise of maintaining holiness.
Spot on. And this is the ordinary nature of the warfare we're talking about today.
Because it feels so justified.
It really does. It requires sober obedience rather than emotional frenzy to detect it.
Right.
When a group of believers thinks they are simply upholding high standards by refusing to forgive someone who has fallen, they might actually be executing a strategy of the adversary.
They are doing his work for him.
Yes, but they feel incredibly righteous while doing it.
Because they think they are protecting the church. They think, we cannot let this person off the hook. We have to protect the purity of the bride of Christ.
But their lack of mercy is actually the infection.
So if an open door of resentment is that dangerous, you have to wonder what on earth was going on in Corinth that made the Apostle Paul issue this specific warning.
We really need to look at the historical spark that prompted 2 Corinthians.
Yeah, what were they doing that left the door wide open?
To understand the letter, you really have to understand the city. The historical backdrop is essential here.
It wasn't just a regular town.
No, first century Corinth was not some sleepy little religious village. It was a wicked, prosperous, thoroughly pagan metropolis.
A massive commercial hub, right?
Yeah, located right on the narrow isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece. So you had sailors, merchants, philosophers, and travelers from all over the Roman Empire converging there.
The texts detail the sheer cultural baggage the congregation brought into the house churches.
And the sources bring up a very specific, historically documented term for this.
Oh, right. Corinthiazestai.
Corinthiazestai.
It's quite a word.
It literally translates to acting like a Corinthian.
Which was not a compliment.
Not at all. In the ancient Greco-Roman world, this was universally understood as a slang term, basically a euphemism for gross immorality and debauchery.
Because Corinth was famous for that massive temple of Aphrodite, right? Up on the mountain.
The Acrocorinth. Yeah, the mountain overlooking the city. The historical record tells us it was heavily associated with institutionalized prostitution.
So that was the air the Corinthian believers breathed every single day.
That was their normal before they encountered the gospel.
So you have these people coming into the covenant community. They are washed, they are justified, but they are still wrestling with the absolute chaos of their cultural background.
They are unlearning decades of paganism.
And that friction leads to a very strained, highly volatile relationship with the Apostle Paul.
The timeline our text lay out is intense.
Walk us through it.
First, you have false apostles infiltrating the church. These are slick, rhetorically impressive teachers who come in and actively challenge Paul's apostolic authority.
They look at Paul, who, works with his hands as a tent maker, who suffers, who is not a flashy public speaker.
Right.
And they tell the Corinthians, this guy is a second-rate apostle. You deserve better.
You deserve philosophers who look and sound like the cultural elite.
And the Corinthians actually start buying into it.
They do, which prompts Paul to make what he refers to as a painful visit.
Let's pause on that painful visit for a second.
Sure.
Try to imagine the sheer awkwardness of this situation for you as a listener. Paul sails all the way across the agency to confront this rebellion in person.
He walks right into the assembly,
Fully expecting his spiritual children to back him up against these arrogant false teachers.
and it goes terribly poorly.
The congregation just sits there. Someone in the church, a specific ringleading offender, blatantly disrespects and insults Paul to his face.
And the rest of the church does absolutely nothing to defend him.
The silence in that room would have been deafening.
It was a total failure of loyalty and a massive public humiliation for Paul.
especially in a culture that valued honor above almost everything else.
So Paul leaves. He retreats across the sea to Ephesus, completely heartbroken.
And from there, he writes what scholars call the severe letter.
The sources note he wrote it out of much affliction and anguish of heart, with many tears.
He sends Titus to deliver it.
And in that letter, Paul essentially demands that the congregation wake up, recognize the rebellion, and formally discipline this insolent offender.
And this brings us to the massive plot twist of the narrative.
The severe letter actually worked.
Titus eventually comes back to Paul with incredible news. The congregation listened.
They held a gathering, they took a majority vote, and they formally disciplined the man who had caused the rupture.
And even more amazingly, the discipline achieved its intended purpose.
The man broke. He experienced genuine godly sorrow. He repented.
You would think that is the end of the story.
A massive pastoral victory, right?
Yeah, but the crisis was not over at all.
Not even close. The text shows us that the church, having successfully disciplined the man, now refused to forgive him.
They swung wildly from their previous antinomian license, where they just tolerated sin and rebellion, all the way over to a rigid, unyielding legalism.
They punished the man, they saw his repentance, but they would not let him back into the fellowship.
Which raises a really crucial question. We usually think of church discipline as kicking someone out.
Right, the heavy, terrible action of excommunication.
But here, the crisis is not about the expulsion. It is about the refusal to let the guy back in.
Yeah.
Why is it so much harder for a community to reinstate someone than to punish them in the first place?
That gets right to the heart of the social dynamics in first-century Roman society.
How so?
You have to understand the mechanics of the shame and honor culture. In that society, your social status, your public perception, was basically your currency.
So to be publicly corrected and disciplined by the entire assembly carried a severe, visceral humiliation.
Yes, so if the church reinstates him, they have to absorb his shame.
Ah, I see. They have to associate themselves with the guy who just publicly humiliated himself and the apostle.
Precisely. Reinstating someone means the community has to embrace the messy, socially costly reality of grace.
It's much easier to just keep your distance.
It is. If they keep him on the outside, they get to feel superior. They get to perform their righteousness by shunning him.
But the texts explain that the goal of discipline in the apostolic church was never a permanent exile.
It was never meant to be a social shaming ritual designed to destroy a person's reputation forever.
The singular driving objective was restoration.
Keeping an offender beneath the community's foot, holding their past over their head as leverage, was a catastrophic failure of the gospel's underlying logic.
It's treating a temporary quarantine as a permanent death sentence.
That's a great way to put it.
You put someone in quarantine to heal them so they can come back to society, not to leave them in the isolation ward to die. To see precisely how the church's refusal to restore this man opened the door to spiritual danger, we really need to look closely at the specific vocabulary Paul uses here.
Let's dig into the Greek for a moment.
Yeah, because our sources place a lot of weight on the exact words Paul chooses to describe Satan's tactics.
The language is incredibly revealing. In 2 Corinthians 2.11, Paul writes his warning so that the church might not be outwitted by Satan.
And the Greek verb used there is pleonektothman.
The sources highlight that this is not a mystical, spooky word at all. It is a highly specific commercial term.
Wait, a commercial term? Like something you would hear in a marketplace negotiation?
Yes. In the Greco-Roman marketplace, the agora, this word described a deceitful merchant, a swindler, or an extortionist who used false ways to cheat a customer.
Oh, wow.
Picture a merchant subtly tipping the scales. So you pay for a pound of grain, but you only receive half a pound.
That's fascinating.
It literally carries the idea of defrauding someone, overreaching, or taking advantage of them for greedy, selfish gain.
Wait, so Paul is not picturing the devil as a roaring, terrifying monster in this specific verse, but as a shady accountant.
Essentially, yes.
Or a dishonest merchant running a scam. How does the concept of extortion map onto a church refusing to forgive someone? What is the devil actually stealing from them?
Well, if we connect this to the broader theology of the New Testament, the analogy is chilling. Satan is acting as a cosmic extortionist.
Okay.
He is trying to defraud the church of its most valuable assets.
Which are what?
Think about it. What are the primary assets of a local church? It's their unity, their joy, their atmosphere of grace, and their corporate testimony to the outside world.
Right.
Satan knows he cannot steal a justified believer's salvation. That is secure in Christ. So instead, he attempts to swindle them out of their fellowship and their witness.
By using false weights, that makes so much
He
sense.
takes the scale and he makes the sin look incredibly heavy, and he makes the grace required to forgive it seem impossible to balance on the other side.
He tricks the church into thinking the debt is too large to cancel.
That is exactly how the false weights operate. He inflates the offense and minimizes the blood of Christ.
The sources also point to the noun Paul uses in the second half of the verse to describe Satan's methods.
Noamata.
Noamata. This refers to designs, thoughts, or schemes, right?
Yeah. Yes, and the root of the word is tied directly to the intellect, the mind.
So the theater of this specific war is not a haunted house or an exorcism room.
No, it is the human mind and its perceptions.
The battlefield is entirely psychological and theological. It's happening in how we think about each other.
Yes. And the texts point out a fascinating grammatical feature Paul uses here, litotes.
Litotes.
Paul says, we are not ignorant of his designs. Litotes is a rhetorical device where you state a strong affirmative by negating its opposite.
By saying we are not ignorant, Paul is telling a church that prided itself on intellectual superiority that they ought to be fully aware, fully discerning of what is happening.
Satan's specific noema, his scheme in this situation, is psychological blinding.
He is blinding the church to the necessity of grace by making strictness look like purity.
It's so subtle.
That is so insidious. You think you are being holy because you are being strict.
Right. You think you are honoring God by refusing to let this guy back in.
But you are actually being robbed blind by the adversary. You are losing your unity while patting yourself on the back for your vigilance.
It creates a counterfeit righteousness.
Yeah.
It is a pharisaical rot that destroys a church from the inside out.
And if Satan's scheme is to twist church discipline into destruction, the immediate practical question becomes, how does a community know when to stop punishing and start comforting?
Which leads us directly to the literary flow of the passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 2.
Right. If we look at the progression of verses 5 through 11, Paul lays out a very clear sequence of pastoral events.
He states that the punishment inflicted by the majority was deemed sufficient.
The goal was reached. The man broke. He was sorrowful.
So Paul issues these urgent, almost frantic commands to the congregation.
Turn to forgive him, comfort the man, and publicly reaffirm your love for him.
The texts stress the severe life or death risk hanging over the offender at this exact moment in the timeline.
Paul warns that if the church delays, if they decide to put him on a prolonged probation, just to make absolutely sure he really means his repentance.
The man is at risk of being overwhelmed by excessive sorrow.
The literal concept there is being swallowed up, consumed, or drowned by despair.
Let's use a medical analogy here to unpack that.
I love a good medical analogy.
Church discipline sounds a lot like surgery. You have to make a painful incision to remove a dangerous infection.
You do not want to do it, but you have to, or the patient will die.
But you do not keep cutting after the infection is gone.
No, you don't.
You do not just leave the patient open on the operating table. If you do not stitch the patient back up, the surgery itself becomes fatal.
The loss of blood will kill them, even if the infection is completely gone.
The necessity of comfort, the stitching up of the wound, just cannot be overstated.
The sources differentiate between two types of sorrow in the human heart, don't they?
They do. There is a godly sorrow, which Paul talks about later in 2 Corinthians 7, that leads to life and true repentance.
That is productive.
But there is another kind of sorrow, a worldly grief.
A crushing despair.
Yes, a despair that Satan weaponizes for sheer destruction. If the church withholds grace, they push the man from godly sorrow into a demonic despair.
And the analysis points out that true forgiveness requires a real, visible disposition of grace.
It is not just a private feeling you have in your heart while you continue to ignore the guy in the hallway at church.
You cannot say, well, I forgave him in my heart, but I'm never talking to him again.
Correct. Biblical forgiveness is a corporate action. Paul specifically states this forgiveness happens in the presence of Christ.
The church must act in a way that the repentant brother knows beyond a shadow of a doubt that he is received back into the fold.
The warmth of the fellowship must be restored.
If the discipline was public, the restoration and the comfort must be equally public and tangible.
You have to look him in the eye, shake his hand, share a meal with him.
Treat him as a brother, not a probationary suspect.
So having looked thoroughly at the first century application and the situation in Corinth, we absolutely have to look at how this exact dynamic plays out in modern ideologies and church models today.
Because human nature has not changed, and Satan's tactics certainly have not changed.
The texts draw some stark cultural contrasts here. pointing out that the modern church often falls into two distinct traps when handling sin.
Okay, the sources contrast the biblical model of discipline and restoration with two widespread modern religious errors.
The first is seeker-sensitive pragmatism.
What does that look like?
This is a church model that avoids discipline entirely in order to keep people happy.
To maintain attendance numbers,
And to avoid bad Yelp reviews, it treats spiritual things therapeutically.
the primary goal is making sure everyone feels validated, avoiding the painful, messy work of confronting sin.
That is the open window again. No alarm system at all.
It is antinomianism dressed up as being welcoming.
And the second error is cold fundamentalism.
This model disciplines gleefully.
It takes a hard, uncompromising stand on truth and purity, but it utterly refuses to restore the broken.
It operates with a posture of perpetual suspicion.
Once you cross a line in a fundamentalist system, you might be technically allowed to attend, but you will wear a scarlet letter forever.
It takes the surgical scalpel and just keeps cutting.
Now, the sources also contrast biblical forgiveness with secular ideologies outside the church.
Yes, and we need to look at this closely. The author of our source text makes a specific, pointed argument here, explicitly naming critical race theory and modern intersectionality.
The author characterizes these as Marxist ideologies.
Right, and just to be clear for you listening, we're simply reporting the author's viewpoint here.
Right.
According to the text, these frameworks function by dividing people into eternal categories of oppressors and oppressed based on group identity.
The author argues that these systems demand perpetual penance from the oppressor class, but the glaring issue is that they offer no mechanism for atonement or grace.
We are bringing this up to impartially report the author's argument. He uses these secular movements as modern examples of unforgiving frameworks to show a stark contrast with the biblical mandate.
In his view, these ideologies represent exactly what happens when a culture demands justice but removes the cross.
The author's point in bringing up those specific cultural frameworks is to illustrate what happens to a society or a church if it adopts that mindset when the concept of final unilateral atonement is erased.
When there is no mechanism for grace, relationships are defined entirely by power dynamics.
Historical grievances and endless cycles of retribution.
You are placed on an internal probation. You can never say enough, do enough, or apologize enough to be fully washed clean and restored to equal standing.
Which makes me wonder about the practical application for a local congregation.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
If the surrounding culture, whether inside a rigid church or outside in a secular society operating on a system of perpetual outrage demands, endless probation, how does a Christian community successfully model this kind of radical, unilateral forgiveness without just becoming a haven for bad behavior?
How do you forgive without becoming an enabler?
Yes, that is the question.
Synthesizing the text's application points gives us a very clear, nuanced path forward. Biblical discernment is not the same as endless suspicion.
Those two things often get conflated by well-meaning Christians.
They do. The text clarified that forgiveness does not instantly erase all natural consequences or restore all practical responsibilities.
Right, there's a distinct difference between extending forgiveness and offering immediate, unconditional trust.
Give example.
Well, if a church treasurer embezzles money, repents, and experiences godly sorrow, the church must fully forgive him, welcome him, and love him.
But they are not going to make him the treasurer again the next week.
Precisely. Trust is rebuilt over time through observable faithfulness.
But forgiveness is granted immediately.
Forgiveness absolutely refuses vengeance.
It refuses to hold the debt over the person's head as a means of social control or manipulation.
The author highlights that a true gospel culture will always offend the world because it takes both sin and grace completely seriously.
The world usually wants to minimize sin, saying it is not a big deal, or it wants to maximize punishment, canceling the person forever.
The church is called to maximize the severity of sin, calling it what it is, and maximize the reach of grace simultaneously.
That is a staggering tightrope to walk.
It feels impossible for a group of flawed, selfish humans to pull that off consistently.
When someone hurts you deeply, your instinct is to protect yourself.
To build a wall, to hold on to that grievance as a shield.
Which brings us to the theological climax of the text.
The ability to execute this kind of holy mercy isn't generated by human willpower.
You cannot just grit your teeth and try harder to be nice.
It requires a focal point outside of ourselves.
This is the essential Christ connection. All church discipline and all true forgiveness happen, as Paul specifically wrote, in the presence of Christ.
Christ is the supreme lawgiver, meaning He sets the perfect standard of holiness that necessitates discipline in the first place.
He does not wink at sin,
But he is also the supreme forgiver.
meaning he sets the standard of mercy that necessitates the complete restoration of the repentant.
The cross of Christ is the ultimate historical intersection of those two things, justice and mercy.
It destroys the liberal denial of guilt, because the cross shows us that sin is so horrifying, so offensive to a holy God, that it required the brutal death of the incarnate Son of God to atone for it.
But it also destroys the legalistic fundamentalist refusal of pardon.
Because the cross shows us that the grace of God is so vast, so infinite, that any repentant sinner can be completely, totally washed clean.
To understand the mechanics of this, we really have to look at the Reformed understanding of Christ's work.
Specifically, his active and passive obedience. The texts bring this theological weight to bear on the situation in Corinth.
Break that down for us.
Sure. Christ's active obedience refers to his perfect, sinless life. He fulfilled the law entirely, earning the positive merit of righteousness.
And his passive obedience refers to his willing submission to the cross.
He absorbed the wrath of God, fully paying the penalty for sin.
So he provides both the spotless record we need and the payment for the debt we owe.
Yes, and the passive obedience is crucial here.
How so?
If Christ has fully absorbed the penalty for a brother's sin, and that brother has repented, what does it mean when the church refuses to forgive him?
Oh, I see where this is going.
It means the church is looking at the cross and saying, Christ's blood was not enough to cover what you did to me. I require an additional payment of your shame and my superiority.
Wow. It is a monstrous theological claim, even if it is made subconsciously.
When we look at this practically, it leads to a striking reality.
We are acting exactly like the unforgiving servant in Jesus' famous parable in Matthew 18.
Think about that story. A servant owes the king an unpayable debt, millions of dollars in modern terms.
The king has mercy and wipes the debt completely clean.
The servant walks out, finds a fellow servant who owes him $20, grabs him by the throat, and throws him in debtor's prison.
That parable maps perfectly onto Paul's warning to the Corinthians. We have been forgiven an infinite debt by God.
To withhold forgiveness for a finite offense committed against us is the ultimate hypocrisy.
By forgiving, the church is dramatically reenacting the gospel on earth.
It is a tangible, visible display of cosmic victory over the adversary.
We are taking the massive, eternal reality of heaven and we are acting it out in the church lobby.
Spot on. When a congregation receives a repentant sinner back into fellowship, when they embrace someone who caused them pain, they are putting the adversary on notice.
They are proving that his extortion scheme failed.
The texts emphasize that we are not fighting Satan for an uncertain victory.
And here I need to report another specific view from the author. The author outlines their dispensational and premillennial views regarding the eschatological timeline.
Right, covering the rapture, the return of Christ, and the final physical crushing of Satan.
Factually reporting the author's theological framework, this perspective of a guaranteed literal future defeat of Satan is what fuels the church's courage in the present.
We do not fight for victory. We fight from the victory already secured by Christ.
The cosmic extortionist has already been judged.
So, to summarize the core takeaways from this thorough investigation into 2 Corinthians,
Satan exploits our righteous indignation.
he takes our genuine desire for purity and he twists it into cruelty.
The mind, our thoughts, our designs, our perceptions of one another is the actual battlefield.
His weapons are false weights, making sin seem unpardonable.
And a disposition of ready, costly forgiveness is our shield against that extortion.
It requires a massive shift in perspective.
Ordinary obedience, the hard, unglamorous, sometimes awkward work of repairing broken relationships in a local church, is the highest, most effective form of spiritual warfare.
You do not need a spectacular exorcism to defeat the demonic.
You need a congregation willing to look a repentant brother in the eye and say, "You are forgiven and we love you."
Which leaves us with a final, lingering thought for you to carry into your week.
We often withhold forgiveness because we think it protects us from being hurt again.
We hold on to our resentment, and it feels like armor. It feels like we are guarding our hearts.
But based on what we've unpacked today, what if that perceived armor is actually a cage built by the adversary?
What if you are locking yourself in with the extortionist?
And what if the person you are absolutely terrified to forgive is precisely the instrument being used by God to test your obedience to the gospel?
A difficult, uncomfortable question, but one the text absolutely demands we ask ourselves if we want to survive the warfare in the pews.
The X-ray machine might be broken when it comes to diagnosing the hidden intentions of the human heart, but the cure for the condition is surprisingly clear. Forgive, comfort, and reaffirm love. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. Until next time.